Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging into something quite fundamental. Touches every single one of us. We're exploring humanity's relationship. Yeah, and we're doing this by looking at a really fascinating stack. We've got excerpts from Death Smiles at Us. All we can do is smile, which pulls together a lot of different philosophical and psychological. Our goal here isn't to be morbid, not at all. It's more about unpacking how various thinkers have wrestled with this ability. And importantly, what can we learn from them? What can their insights tell us about living, a richer, more meaningful life? So maybe just to kick things off, question, what does death actually mean to, or maybe something else? It's funny how we often just, push the thought of death away, isn't it? Sort of unconscious, final horror, not being, or the fear of pain, or losing people we love. But despite how different all our lives are, death is that one great common thread.
And our sources frame it as something that deprives us of life, and the good that life contains. The basic idea being that life, even with suffering, is worth living. That more life is good as long as you're conscious. Makes sense.
But then, here's a twist. What if? What if we didn't die? What if we could live, indefinitely? The source brings up this really counterintuitive point. If we had endless time, wouldn't that just lead to massive procrastination? Widespread laziness. Think about it. No deadline, no urgency, less reason to make today count, right? A potential outcome. Maybe a whole society of deeply unhappy, unfulfilled people just drifting along, which leads to this really provocative thought. Maybe death is actually what gives life its value, its edge.
Wow, yeah. That definitely flips the script. The ticking clock is a motivator.
Yeah.
And speaking of challenging how we think, the philosopher Thomas Nagel, he identified a couple of common mistakes people make when thinking about death. The first one he talks about is this asymmetry, our different attitudes towards the time after we die versus the time before we were born. You hear the argument a lot, right? We weren't bothered by not existing before birth, so why fear not existing after death? Seems parallel.
It does seem logical at first glance, but Nagel's counter is quite sharp, actually. He says, look, the time after death is time that death takes away from you. It's potential life you would have lived if you hadn't died. But the time before you were born, you weren't deprived of anything. You just hadn't arrived yet. There was no you to lose that time. So prenatal non-existence isn't a loss in the same way posthumous non-existence. They're fundamentally different experience, or rather, non-experience.
Okay. That distinction is crucial. It's not about non-existence itself, but the loss of future life. And Nagel's second mistake, trying to imagine being dead, which he points out is just logically impossible. Your mind isn't functioning. You can't experience non-existence.
Exactly. That's where Epicurus comes in with his famous line, death does not concern us because as long as we exist, death is not here. And when it does come, we know. So the fear maybe isn't of being dead, but of the process, the pain, the suffering before death, which then raises a really important question. If the state of being dead isn't the issue, what should we be concerned about?
Which brings us very neatly to Ernest Becker in his book, The Denial of Death. And it's quite poignant. He was diagnosed with cancer, died just 2 years after it was published, and won the Pulitzer posthumously. His core idea is really powerful. He says we're essentially born terrified. Our basic drive, deep down, is this biological need to control our basic anxiety, to deny the terror of death. He puts it so starkly. This is the terror to have emerged from nothing, to have a named consciousness of self, deep inner feeling, and with all this yet to die.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And because it's so overwhelming, Becker says we build defense unconsciously, of course. The first line in defense, he calls it the vital lie of character, like a child thinking, if I'm like my powerful dad, I won't die. This morphs into adulthood as this desperate need for cosmic significance, trying to prove we're uniquely valuable, a hero, essentially. We need to feel like our life matters more than just ending, like we've made a mark, contributed something lasting.
So we construct these personalities, these achievements like armor. But what's the downside? What's the cost of this character armor?
Well, it makes us feel safer, yeah. Makes the world seem less chaotic, more managed. But the paradox, according to Becker, is that life escapes us while we huddle within the defended fortress of character. We actually end up shrinking from life. We're too busy defending against death to actually fully live. We trade authenticity for a feeling of security.
That's sobering.
Yeah.
So if character is the first line of defense, what's the second? Becker says it's society's hero system. Cultures offer these symbolic systems, often covertly religious, he says. They give us ways to feel like we transcend death by, participating in something bigger than ourselves, like building a family, making a fortune, creating art, writing a book, something that might last beyond our individual existence. He even mentions this basic narcissism in things like war, where soldiers might feel, oh, he might die, the guy next to me, but not me. It's a deep denial.
Right.
So what's Becker's advice then? It's pretty radical, he says. Contemplate death? Don't deny it, face it. He believes that cultivating this awareness leads to disillusionment, seeing through the fences, losing the character armor. And then you can make a conscious choice to abide in the face of terror. That's his existential hero. This hero sees their own vulnerability, their own impotence, and then chooses either despair or maybe a leap of faith. But admitting this deep need for heroism, that's incredibly hard. We usually disguise it. Maybe it looks like, as Becker puts it, piling up figures in a bank book to reflect privately our sense of heroic worth. He really stresses that becoming conscious of how you're trying to earn that feeling of significance, of heroism. That's a core self-analytic problem of life. Understanding your own deep game.
That's a heavy challenge. Okay, so Becker presents this picture of terror and denial. Let's shift now to a very different approach, the Stoic. For them, death wasn't terrifying at all. It was just natural. A natural process, not fear. Exactly, and that's central to their practice of memento. More, remember you must die. It wasn't about Marcus Aurelius and like, think of yourself as dead. You've lived. Now take what's left and live it properly. For the Stoics, the real death, but never beginning to live. Failing to live that. And Epictetus had that wonderfully I have to die. If it is now, well then I die now. If later, then now I die. It sounds almost casual. Found you up. Stops you take immerse yourself. Life focus. Sudden lot.
That's a powerful kind of presence, is acceptance is liberation. And moving on from the Stoics, Nietzsche offers yet another angle. He didn't just accept death. He kind of embraced it, celebrated it, especially with his idea of free death. Yeah, his concept of die at the right time. He saw death not as just an end, but potentially a consummation of life, something dignified by the meaning of the life lived, maybe even a triumphant conclusion.
And he was really critical of what he called the preachers of death, those who promoted weariness, renunciation, pessimism, people who looked at sickness or old age and saw it as a reason to devalue life itself. Nietzsche rejected that completely. He also had this intriguing idea of the living dead. Not literal zombies, but people who avoid life's challenges. Maybe they escape into endless work or deny life's richness through asceticism or just drift passively. That, for Nietzsche, was another kind existing without truly living.
And thinking about dying at the right time, achieving that consummation. It's hard not to think of Socrates. The founder of Western philosophy, maybe he actually lived that idea. Declared wisest by the oracle, pushed know thyself, famous for I know that I know nothing, always questioning with his Socratic method, and then famously sentenced to death by hemlock. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. That's when he gave us the unexamined life is not worth living. And crucially, he refused exile, refused to escape prison when given the chance. He stuck to his principles.
Absolutely. That refusal, it's pure integrity, isn't it? Choosing his principles over mere survival and those famous last words. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect. The common interpretation is him thanking Asclepius, the god of healing, for curing him of the sickness of life with death. The cock was a symbol of rebirth, of dawn. So it suggests he saw death not just as an end, but perhaps a transition, healing. A fitting end.
An incredible example. And his final advice to his friend, work to purify their souls, serve others with compassion, dedicate their lives to the community's health, purpose right to the end. Okay, one more major perspective. Carl Jung. He had this idea that we must be as ready to live as to die. He actually said death is psychologically as important as birth, an integral part of life. And even more strikingly, death is not an end, but a goal.
Yeah, Jung was quite critical of modern culture's imbalance, this intense focus on life and almost total denial of death. He was all about integrating opposites. He felt that as people age, life poses this categorical question about death and you have an obligation to answer it. And his advice, you need a myth about death because reason, he thought, just shows us a dark pit. But myth provides helpful and enriching pictures, a framework for understanding this transition, this goal.
And for Jung, myth wasn't just a made-up story. It emerges from deep within the psyche through things like active imagination, dreams, intuition, synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences. It's a symbolic truth from within. He actually had a profound near-death experience himself after a heart attack. He described this vision, seeing a huge granite temple floating in space. And as he approached it, he had this sudden, intense realization. I consisted of my own history. This is what I am.
He described the feeling as extreme poverty, letting go of everything earthly, but also great fullness. He felt he existed objectively, beyond desire or regret. The idea of annihilation just became irrelevant. He said, I had everything that I was, and that was everything. Total completeness. And he felt certain he was about to enter this illuminated room and meet all the people he truly belonged with, understand his whole life's purpose, historical nexus.
But then he was pulled back. Saw his doctor, felt drawn back to life, which afterwards felt like a prison compared to the vision's freedom. But that experience fueled his later work, especially on the synthesis of opposite, the mysterium canuncium.
And Jung was absolutely adamant these visions weren't hallucinations. He called them most tremendous, utterly real, having absolute objectivity. For him, it was a genuine encounter with a different layer of reality, profoundly shaping his views on life and death.
So where does all this leave us? We've gone from basic fear and denial, looked at Nagel's logic traps, then Becker's deep dive into our terror and defenses, the Stoics' calm acceptance, Nietzsche's embrace, Socrates' example, Jung's view of death as a goal. Quite a journey.
It really is. And if the core idea is that death smiles at us all, and maybe our best response is to smile back with understanding, what does that mean practically? It seems to point beyond just not being afraid. It points towards transformation. So the final thought for you perhaps is this: how might you consciously weave the reality of death into your daily life? Not as something terrifying, but maybe, just maybe, as a catalyst, something that sharpens your focus on meaning, on purpose, on truly living.
Something to definitely continue digging into. We hope this deep dive has given you some rich food for thought.